So I was asked at a presentation once why Charis had so many anchors and why they were so large. And my response was that if you consider the amount of time that you spend on your anchor trying to relax or sleep or rest, and you compare that to the amount of time it takes to set or retrieve your anchor, it seemed to me that it was a pretty good investment to use the best ground tackle you could to get the job done. So here on the bow, I have 45-pound Rockna as the primary on the starboard side, connected to 125 feet of 5/16 high tensile chain, and on the port side, a 33-pound Rockna that's connected to 100 feet of 3/8 proof coil chain. And then up on top, I've got a kedge that can easily be carried out in the dinghy and set with its own rode. So you probably noticed that I don't have an anchor windlass, either manual or electric. That's something that may change at some point. So this discussion today is primarily going to be about hauling back. What I want to do is put a little bit of physics into the discussion about the mechanics of hauling back an all-chain rode and a relatively substantial ground tackle without mechanical assistance. Some of this will apply if you have a windlass, if you have particularly an electric windlass. These are very high powered, typically around 1,000-watt motors. And if you try and make that motor do all of the work that we're going to talk about here all at once, you probably are going to have a lot of maintenance and find your breaker tripping quite often. So while this is primarily meant to discuss manually hauling back without a windlass, a lot of what I talk about here will apply if you sort of think about it a little bit the way you do use the windlass you have. So why do I not have a windlass? Short discussion about that. First of all, an electric windlass would be my choice, and may be my choice at some point. But as with anything, a windlass installation is a system installation. It's not a device installation. You have got to think through how you're going to get nearly 100 amps of power if you're talking about a 12-volt, 1,000-watt windlass, which is sort of typical for a 35-foot boat. How are you going to get that power to that windlass? You are either going to use some very heavy cables from your existing batteries or a dedicated battery bank up in the bow. If you don't, what will happen is the windlass will look for that some 83 amps of electricity. If it can't get the power through the wires because they're too small or because the run is too long, then the voltage will drop. When the voltage drops, the unit will correspondingly look for even more amps, and hence the issue with overheating motors, wires getting hot, breakers tripping, etc. So this has got to be something that's thought through from one end to the other, not just dropped in. As to why I don't have a manual windlass, as a single-handed sailor, my opinion is that they are just too slow to be used safely in what are often very crowded harbors around here. What I mean by that is that the final stage that we'll discuss in this breakdown has to happen quickly if you're sailing alone, because you're on the bow doing it, and before you fall off and become a hazard to another boat, you've got to get back and get the boat under control. So that last phase, once the anchor breaks the bottom and gets between then and when it gets up to the bow roller, has to all take place far more quickly than any manual windlass I've ever seen can do it. So for that reason, I've kind of written off the advantage of a manual windlass for my sailing. So what I want to do is break this down into sort of 3 separate steps. And I think if you do it that way, not only is it easier on you, but if you're using some kind of a windlass, it's much easier on the hardware. So what we called in physics hat tip Professor Larry Ward, the great physics professor of my college days. We called these free body diagrams, and these are done just the way we did them 40 years ago, with pencil and paper or a dry erase board. Anyway, so in the first step here, the first phase, you have your boat sitting at rest, your anchor set in the bottom, and your anchor chain is in this drooping loop referred to as catenary. And that's basically just the weight of the anchor chain combined with the anchor holding you still. So the next thing that's going to happen is you're going to haul back, you're going to pull on your anchor chain. And as you do that, the first thing that happens is you lift the catenary loop vertically upward. So what you're doing now is you're not lifting the anchor, you're not essentially pulling the anchor off the bottom yet. You're lifting the loop. And what I do now is I pause. And here on the bow, I've got this little fork that's essentially just a chain stop, temporary chain stop. I would never rely on this to hold the boat. But this chain stop allows you to take a rest if you want to, or you just stand and hold the chain steady. While you're doing that, while you're holding that catenary loop vertically higher than gravity wants it, the boat starts to move ahead. And this imparts forward motion on the boat, which then allows the catenary loop to go back down to its normal drooping position. So now the boat has started to move. What you've done is you've just lifted the catenary loop. That's it. That's all the work you've provided. Once that loop drops and you see the angle of the chain, which you can kind of see a little bit in these videos, where the chain comes up and then slowly goes back down. What you've done is you've started the boat in motion. And that doesn't need to be a tremendous amount of force. It doesn't take much to get the boat moving. And well, of course, depending on the wind. But once the boat is in motion, what you're going to do is you're going to haul, you're going to pause, and you're going to watch that chain. And when the chain drops back to vertical, now you're ready to haul again with no more force than the first pull took. I try and do this mostly with my knees. And in this picture, I'm probably a little more vertical than I should be. If it's windier, my back tends to be more in line with the chain. So you want to do the work of hauling back with your knees so you don't hurt your lower back. But, you know, so essentially you haul and you pause. Now what will happen is eventually you'll get to this last third phase and the boat will be directly over the anchor. Now, somewhere in the process between these steps, I have taken a long pause, and generally, if I'm not in too crowded a harbor, I'll go back and I'll raise the main. That is because on Charis, the engine is the auxiliary, not the sails. I want to know that the boat is under control if there is a sudden engine stop when I'm on the way out of the harbor. So typically raise the main, and then come back to this last stage. Now, this is the hard part. This is where the work is done. If you do all this quickly, or if your sail is starting to move the boat around on the anchor, very often the motion of the boat is going to break the anchor free for you. Not always. There will be times, and because I have an engine, the engine is ready to go to pop the anchor out of the bottom and free. But quite often, if you time this all right, the conditions are settled enough, the forward momentum of the boat will cause it to override the anchor, pop it loose, and then you have your last phase. Now this last phase is lifting the weight of the anchor and the weight of the chain to the bow roller. So naturally, this is the heaviest lifting of the entire process. The way you make that manageable is you control the water depth you've anchored in. Obviously, if you're in 15 feet of water, you're lifting one weight, and if you're in 50, you're lifting quite another, the chain weight contributing. So essentially, part of this, of not having a windlass, is that I do look for manageable water depths that work. And, you know, if you're typically anchoring on a 5-to-1 scope, which I try and do, and you've got 125 feet of scope, that sort of says that you're anchoring in 25 feet or less. And I've found that to be quite manageable. So just to recap here and sum everything up, the bottom line advice is don't try and do everything at once. If you break this process of hauling back down into small pieces or individual steps, as it were, what you'll do is make it a much more manageable task. And that's extremely important if you're doing it by hand, but it's equally important if you're trying to make this work with an anchor windlass that you don't want to absolutely destroy. Good advice I got from Dodge Morgan, the famous circumnavigator way back. When asked how he managed the really difficult times in his solo circumnavigation, he said it was easy. All you do is break it down into manageable units. If 5 minutes is all you can handle, then tell yourself you just got to get through the next 5 minutes, and then 5 minutes after that. And so with anything, I guess that's pretty good advice. Anyway, thanks for coming aboard today.